Neuroscience and Racism, the Power of Groups for Overcoming Implicit Bias.
Yes.
How did you find yourself at the intersection of race, neuroscience, and group therapy to be talking about this?
Yes. Well, from my early work in groups, I was always, I wasn't as sensitive in thinking about issues of diversity myself, even though as an African-American woman in mixed race group, obviously racial dynamics were going on, but the racial dynamics in those groups that I led at Howard that were all Black, and also even if, all white groups, it doesn't matter, all Asian, all of a certain even specific ethnic group, there's still racial dynamics, ethnic dynamics going on, but it's often more apparent when you have a mixture, when the groups are more heterogeneous. So that was going on, but I wasn't necessarily attending to it because we know where the literature, talking in the 1980s, there was not much written about, addressing issues of race in group therapy. So I was kind of clueless, partly related to my willingness to engage that in the context of group. But as time went on and I deepened my own cultural competence and thinking about these issues for individual work and for training in general, then I started to apply that to group. So I actually wrote an article about this, I think it came out in, that might have been 98, working with racial themes in group therapy. And that is I shared that, I was ignoring some of those issues, but then began to attend to it. So it feels, because that's now almost 5 years ago now, it feels like I have been doing this it's a natural intersection. That's kind of how but it actually wasn't. I grew this myself and then needed to become more intentional. And now, of course, I've been training folks over time, my students and colleagues in these areas. But neuroscience, that was interesting. That was an AGPA connection because my colleague was presenting on neuroscience. He did a neuroscience presentation. He had PowerPoint slides, and he was describing, Dr. Stevens, he was describing some of this work that he was doing, and he was mainly highlighting the real neuroscience, so the images, not as much talking about group processes and not as much talking about racial identity. So not so much the cultural competence literature, but he's really kind of talking about neuroscience and race. So, he got some feedback even in the moment as we discussed some things in the presentation. And I think maybe I was Institute co-chair. I do not believe I was AGPA Connect co-chair. I'm almost certain that's correct at that time. So after the presentation, I probably just out of that same spirit, because we were trying to increase appreciation of cultural dynamics, all of the presentations, I probably offered something both from my expertise in the ways that you've noted it, but also in thinking about what we want to see more in AGPA Connect. And what was amazing, he was so open, and, we talked about it right after the meeting, his presentation, I should say. And then he contacts me later and says, Alexis, would you be willing to, present with me next year? So we did this for, I lose track of time, at least 3 years, 4 years. And then we finally said, well, let's write an article. Let's write up what we have done and what we've learned in this context. So it was like the merging. So I brought more of the group dynamics and the knowledge, as I mentioned, of cultural competence, but he really brought the neuroscience focus. So my research earlier on was in hypertension and anger management. I look at survivors in spirituality and eating disorders and spirituality. So the intersection with some kind of physical, either disease or dimension is almost natural for me. So the neuroscience and, it's now looking at the brain in terms of its manifestation, that felt comfortable, just, taking a few steps forward in terms of that. But he really brought that specific expertise to the table in terms of knowing that literature.
Well, all this stuff is embodied, isn't it?
Oh yes, and it's multi-layered, right? So it's embodied, and we understand embodiment now. We're not splitting that off from the mind and it's fully, all of those dimensions are operating together, and interpersonal too.